You never forget the sound of a Wyoming blizzard when it truly wants to kill you. The wind doesn't just howl, it screams, battering every inch of Elk Hollow, flattening fences, and hurling snow sideways in vicious sheets. Raina Hughes stood at her kitchen window, mug in hand, watching as the storm turned the fields to a boiling white sea. It was nearly midnight, but the light in her cabin was the only warmth for miles. Every other house in Elk Hollow had gone dark hours ago, lines down, transformers fried. Out here you learn to keep candles, a lantern, and wood stacked higher than hope. The phone in her pocket was useless. A dead black mirror, Raina traced the rim of her chipped mug and tried not to think about Scott, or the brittle way he'd said goodbye on their porch 4 months ago. He'd left a pair of gloves behind, the right one with a frayed thumb, and she still found it sometimes tucked behind the feed bin. She tried not to care. Most nights she failed, but tonight wasn't about heartbreak. It was survival. The old stable roof had started creaking hours ago, threatening collapse under the weight of ice and packed snow. If it gave, she'd lose the only dry shelter for her 2 aging mares. So, layered in every sweater she owned, she grabbed the snow shovel and braced herself against the door. The wind nearly tore it off the hinges. Cold bit through her jeans and slashed at her cheeks. It was so sharp it stole the breath from her lungs. Every step to the stable was a battle. Her boots crunched on the ice, then slid sideways as a gust shoved her hard enough to stagger. She muttered curses into her scarf, her eyes watering, snowflakes freezing on her lashes. The world was reduced to the blur of her headlamp and the groaning shapes of fences and trees, everything else erased by the storm. She'd almost made it to the stable when she heard it, a sound so strange it stopped her heart for a moment. It was a whinny, low, raw, and guttural. Not the high-pitched nicker of her mares, but something rougher, desperate. She froze. It wasn't possible. No animal should be out there, not in this. Her mind raced. A coyote? No, the sound was too large, too broken. Maybe she'd imagined it, nerves playing tricks. The wind roared again, rattling the stable doors, and she nearly convinced herself to turn back. But there it was again, a shuddering, choking whinny, so close it sounded like it was in her own chest. Raina's breath fogged in front of her, hands shaking not from cold, but a deep, twisting dread. She could just go back inside, pretend she hadn't heard anything. Just another thing to survive and forget. But something pulled her forward, a stubborn streak she'd had since she was a kid growing up wild in the hills. Her father always said, "Don't ignore what needs seeing, Raina. Not if you can help it." She found the lantern, lit it with numb fingers, and swung it into the darkness. The beam flickered across the yard, catching only the wild swirl of snow. "Hello?" she shouted, though her voice barely carried. She stepped past the stable, moving toward the old fence line. Each footfall was a test of courage, the wind shoving her sideways, snow rising above her boots. Another sound. Louder, a desperate, shuddering cry. She stumbled forward, heart pounding, until the lantern beam flickered over a crumpled shape at the edge of the pasture. A horse. No, not just a horse. A huge black stallion sprawled in the snow, legs tangled in shattered fencing. His hide was slick with sweat, steaming despite the cold. Blood streaked his flank, his sides heaving. Raina's mind went blank for a moment, only able to process the impossible. This was no wild Mustang. He was massive, almost regal, but his body was battered, ribs showing, his mane caked with ice and blood. She dropped to her knees, the cold biting through layers, and reached a trembling hand toward him. He rolled a wild eye, white showing all the way around. Raina's voice came out hoarse. "Hey, easy, easy, boy. I'm not gonna hurt you." He snorted, tried to thrash, but the fence wire dug deeper. Blood seeped faster, staining the snow black. She cursed herself for not bringing wire cutters. She'd have to improvise. Dropping the lantern in the snow, she slipped off her scarf and tried to wrap it around his muzzle, both to calm him and keep him from biting. He jerked, but she pressed her hand to his neck, feeling the frantic pulse under his skin. "I know it hurts," she whispered, blinking away tears that instantly froze on her cheeks. "Just hold on. Hold on." It took minutes that felt like hours, her hands clumsy with cold, working the wire loose from his legs. Every time the metal caught, the stallion let out a sound that twisted something deep inside her, a sound no living thing should have to make. When the last strand finally snapped, the horse slumped, shivering, foam at his lips. She couldn't lift him. She couldn't even move him far. But she could get him out of the wind, at least. With her last strength, she tugged his halter, old, frayed leather, not something wild horses wore. He staggered to his feet, almost toppling into her, his massive head drooping against her shoulder. She felt his breath, hot and ragged, blowing through her jacket. Together they limped through the storm, one agonizing step at a time until the stable doors yawned open, lights spilling out, warmth beckoning. Raina led him inside, past the shocked gazes of her mares, into the empty stall she'd always meant to clean, but never had the heart for. She bolted the door behind them. Only then did she realize her hands were bleeding, her hair plastered to her face with sleet. But she didn't care. The horse was alive for now. And as she looked into his dark, exhausted eyes, she felt something shift, a flicker of purpose, sharp and strange. She wasn't alone in the storm anymore. Raina Hughes, wildlife illustrator, heartbroken, lost, and nearly frozen, had just become the reluctant guardian of a mystery, a Winnie in the whiteout, a horse who should have been dead but wasn't. Not yet. And in Elk Hollow, where the wind wrote stories in snow, nothing that survived the night ever stayed unchanged. The barn was the oldest thing on Raina's property, a squat, weathered structure built by hands that had vanished generations ago. Tonight, it was the only patch of light and warmth in the miles of frozen dark. The storm battered the walls and rattled the windows, but inside, the air shimmered with the heat of the wood stove. Raina shoved more logs into the fire, not caring that the stack would run low by morning. She needed the heat now, for herself, and for the black stallion whose presence dominated the space. He stood trembling in the straw, ears flicking wildly, sides heaving. Up close, the scale of him was breathtaking. His coat, now slowly drying, was so dark it seemed to drink in the light. Ice clung to the tangled mass of his mane and tail. His chest still rose and fell in uneven surges, breath whistling through flared nostrils. Every so often, he glanced at Raina with eyes wide and wild, rimmed in white, as if daring her to try something foolish. Raina crouched just outside the stall, a thick wool blanket draped over her shoulders. The cold had numbed her fingers, and she had to work them hard to grip the first aid kit she dug out from the tack room. There were old bandages, rolls of vet tape, a cracked bottle of antiseptic, and a box of nitrile gloves that had seen better years. "Okay, big guy," she murmured, her voice low and steady. "Let's see what we're dealing with." The horse responded with a sharp stomp, nostrils flaring, hooves shifting as if he might bolt. Raina kept her movements slow, deliberate, the way her mother had taught her long ago. Talk low, move slow, let the animal see your hands. She stepped inside the stall, shutting the half door behind her. The other two mares watched silently from the next stall, their own forms mere shadows in the dim lantern light. Raina found herself whispering old, half-remembered lines from lullabies she'd heard as a child. "Sleep, my darling. Close your eyes. The wind will guard you safe tonight." The stallion's head jerked toward her. She could see now that his flank was a mess, a line of torn flesh along the hind leg, still oozing blood where the wire had dug in. It was bad, but not hopeless. She knelt slowly, one hand extended. The horse tensed, a shudder running from his withers to his tail, but didn't pull away. "That's it. I'm not here to hurt you," she whispered, tears prickling at her eyes from the strain, the fear, and the desperate need to help. She pressed a folded towel to the worst of the wounds. The stallion grunted, teeth bared in warning. Blood seeped through, warm and sticky. Her hands shook as she poured antiseptic over the wound. The stallion kicked, smashing a bucket against the wall, sending a burst of straw flying. Raina flinched but didn't retreat. Sorry, I know that stings." She felt her voice wobble, then harden. "But you're not dying on my watch, not tonight." She worked quickly, hands remembering what her mind had forgotten. How to knot a bandage one-handed. How to tie a quick-release knot if a horse panicked. Her mother's voice seemed to echo in the barn. "Keep your fear quiet, girl. Horses can smell it better than wolves." The fire crackled. The wind outside howled like something hungry. Inside, the stallion was breathing easier, though his legs still trembled with exhaustion. She sank to her knees, singing under her breath now, the words coming back as if they'd never left her. "Softly now. Let darkness go, the dawn will find you warm and whole." A strange thing happened then. The stallion's frantic gaze lost some of its edge. He lowered his massive head, breath sighing out like the last of the storm. For a moment, he simply listened, eyes half closed, the tension in his frame melting away. Raina's heart pounded. She reached up, tentative, and ran her hand down his neck. He didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned into the touch just for a second. Raina swallowed hard, fighting tears. In that fragile, silent space between two living creatures, something shifted. The lullaby ended, and the barn felt bigger somehow, warmer, less haunted by the violence of the storm. Raina drew back, gently checking his hooves and legs for other wounds. That's when she noticed something odd, half hidden beneath the matted hair on his neck. An ugly, puckered scar, raised in a shape that looked almost deliberate. She parted the hair and found, burned deep and nearly erased, the remnants of a brand, something military, not ranch. The letters were hard to make out, but the pain of its origin was clear. "Who did this to you?" she whispered, a sick dread rising in her chest. Her mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Horses weren't branded like this in Elk Hollow, not even wild mustangs. A memory flickered. News stories about secret government animal units, experimental programs she'd always dismissed as conspiracy nonsense. But here, in her own barn, was living proof of something cruel and deliberate. The stallion shifted, a soft whicker in his throat. Raina knew that whatever life he'd lived before, it had been hard. No horse gets a scar like that by accident. She felt a surge of anger at whoever had hurt him, at the world for letting it happen, and at herself for not knowing what to do next. She finished dressing his wounds, working until her hands ached and the fire was little more than glowing coals. When she finally sank onto the old milking stool, she realized she hadn't thought of Scott, or her own heartache, for hours. The storm outside faded to a dull roar. The horses settled. The black stallion, whom she'd begun to call Ash in her mind, lowered himself with a groan into the straw and slept. Raina leaned against the stall, blanket wrapped tight, listening to the slow, steady sound of his breathing. There was blood on the hearth and on her hands, but for the first time in months, she didn't feel numb. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside, by firelight, a battered soul began to heal. And as Raina drifted into an uneasy sleep, the echo of her mother's lullaby mingled with the sound of hooves in dreams, promising that dawn and answers would come. The blizzard finally spent itself in the small hours of the morning, leaving Elk Hollow silent and shrouded beneath a cold, crystalline blanket. When Raina woke, her first thought was of Ash. Pain rippled in her muscles as she sat up, legs stiff from sleeping against the stall. The fire in the barn stove had dwindled to embers, but the air was bearable, alive with the scent of hay, singed wood, and horse. For a moment, Raina just watched Ash sleep. The black stallion's sides rose and fell in steady rhythm, lashes tangled with straw, lips twitching in some private dream. Light from the one intact window traced the line of his battered flank, painting the barn in streaks of gold and blue. Her other horses, Maple and June, stood in their stalls, tails swishing softly, casting curious glances toward their new, broken companion. The world outside was motionless, muffled by drifts and silence. Raina's entire body ached, her back, her arms, her bruised knees from kneeling in the snow, but her mind was awake in a way it hadn't been in years. She rummaged through her tack trunk for a clean blanket and more ointment. The snow outside refracted light through the window, sending shifting prisms onto the barn wall. The air felt new, washed clean. Ash stirred as she entered the stall, eyes rolling open with the quickness of prey. For a heartbeat, panic flashed there. Then recognition. Raina slowed, crouched, and offered her hand. "It's just me," she whispered. Ash watched her, as if weighing her soul, then let his head drop again. The wound on his flank was ugly, but cleaner now, seeping only a little. She changed the bandages, wincing at each soft grunt of discomfort. When she finished, she lingered, letting her palm rest over the jagged brand on his neck. Ash flinched, only a tremor, but didn't pull away. Outside, the sun glimmered fiercely off the snow, lighting up the pasture with a kind of blinding hope. Raina almost forgot what day it was. The storm had turned everything upside down. There was no mail, no power, no demands but survival and caretaking. She found herself oddly grateful. In the absence of expectation, something in her began to loosen. A mug of coffee, strong and black, steamed in her hands as she retreated to her studio, a corner of the house that had been dormant for months. Sketchbooks lay in untidy stacks, pencils dull, canvases half-finished and abandoned. For years, Raina's art had been her livelihood and her refuge, but since the breakup with Scott, every line felt forced. Her hands remembered, but her heart had been locked away. Today, though, she found herself compelled to draw. Ash, battered and proud, lingered in her mind like a half-heard melody. She started with broad strokes, his wide shoulders, his haunted eyes, the tangled mane. It was as if her fingers were moving on their own, capturing the tension in his stance, the pain wrapped in every muscle. Time slipped away. She worked through the morning, and when she looked up, the barn was awash in gold, and Ash stood watching her through the open stall door. She laughed, soft and surprised. "You want to see what I'm doing, big guy?" She turned the sketchbook so Ash could look, feeling ridiculous. But somehow, it made sense. He stretched his neck, sniffed at the page, then let out a deep sigh and settled down. For the first time since he'd arrived, his body seemed to rest. There was something in the way he watched her, like he understood. Afternoon melted into evening. Raina carried her drawing supplies to the barn, setting up a makeshift studio by Ash's stall. She spent hours sketching him as he slept, noting every scar, every ripple of muscle beneath the black coat. Maple and June watched with gentle interest, sometimes nuzzling Ash through the bars, as if reassuring him that he was not alone. It was strange, Raina thought, how quickly the silence of her life had changed. Days before, every minute had felt like a stone tied to her chest, each moment weighed down by grief, regret, and the unspoken certainty that nothing would ever really change. Now, with Ash sleeping beside her, the quiet was different. It wasn't sharp and lonely. It was full, alive, brimming with possibility. Once, while she drew, Raina set down her pencil and reached through the bars to touch Ash's scarred chest. His skin twitched beneath her fingers, but he didn't move away. Not a long moment. She just left her hand there, feeling the slow, steady thump of his heart. She thought of her own heart, how long it had felt hollow, like a house abandoned after a fire. For the first time in what felt like forever, she let herself be present in the quiet. No guilt, no self-recrimination. Just two survivors sharing the same patch of earth. Days passed. The roads were still impassable, the town still largely cut off, but the world thawed bit by bit. Raina's studio transformed into a makeshift rehabilitation center. The kitchen was full of steam, broth, and bandages. The old radio flickered to life on a weak battery, playing country songs and weather updates. At night, she brought her sleeping bag into the barn, afraid to leave Ash alone even for a few hours. Sometimes he'd wake her with a soft snort, pressing his nose against her shoulder as if checking that she was real. Their routine became a kind of ritual: feed, clean, check wounds, sketch, talk. The lines in her notebook grew more detailed, the scenes more alive. Raina lost hours in the flow, sometimes forgetting to eat or sleep. She found herself telling Ash stories of her childhood, her failed marriage, the sketches she never finished, the places she wanted to see before she died. She poured her heart into the silence, and Ash listened, his great dark eyes holding her secrets like water in a well. One evening, as dusk pooled in the corners of the barn, Raina looked up from her sketchpad to find Ash watching her with a gaze so intense it made her breath catch. There was intelligence there. Pain, yes, but also a quiet strength. She felt seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. It was as if all the words she couldn't speak, all the loneliness she'd carried, were understood by this battered, resilient creature. "Thank you," she whispered, not sure what she was thanking him for. Maybe for surviving. Maybe for reminding her how to see. Maybe just for staying. That night, as snowflakes began to fall again outside the barn, Raina realized that healing was not a straight path. It wasn't about fixing all the broken things. It was about finding moments of peace in the chaos, about sitting in the quiet and letting yourself be known, without apology, without expectation. Ash slept, wounds slowly closing, breath even and deep. Raina leaned against the stall door, sketchbook in her lap, heart a little less heavy. For the first time in years, she felt the silence wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. And outside, the world waited, bright and cold and full of new beginnings. The slow Wyoming thaw came grudgingly, like a stubborn old rancher who didn't trust spring. Day by day, Elk Hollow pulled itself from the grip of winter. Snow shrank back from fence posts, revealing muddy fields littered with broken branches and old memories. The air tasted new, sun and sap and cold earth, the whole world bracing for the rush of green that would soon blanket the hills. For Raina, it was a welcome change. The days grew brighter, the barn a little warmer each morning, and Ash, though still limping, stood straighter in his stall, his coat sleek now where the blood and ice had been. She let him out into the small paddock on sunny afternoons, letting him feel the wind that didn't bite so hard. Maple and June, her two mares, watched with cautious interest, occasionally touching noses with Ash through the fence. It became part of their daily rhythm. Raina would open the paddock gate. Ash would pace along the perimeter, nostrils wide, testing every new sound. Some days she swore he almost smiled, as if surprised to still be alive. But the scars he carried were more than skin deep. Raina noticed it first when a neighbor's ATV backfired on the road, the sound distant but sharp as a rifle crack. Ash's entire body locked, muscles bunching, eyes wide. He threw his head, snorting so violently Raina's heart lurched. She rushed to him, voice low, hands out, trying to bridge the yawning chasm of panic. "Easy. Easy, Ash. I'm here. Nothing's going to hurt you now." But he didn't settle for long. After that, every unexpected noise made him flinch. The flap of a tarp, the snap of a twig. Raina saw it in the tightness of his jaw, the way his ears flicked, how he always watched the horizon as if expecting trouble. The worst came one morning as she led him along the old North Trail. Patches of snow lingered beneath the pines, and the air was sharp with thawed pine needles and river ice. Ash moved slowly beside her, hooves careful on the soft ground, ears turning to every creak and whisper of the woods. Raina had just started telling him an old story, something about her first Mustang, wild as a comet, when a sudden sharp snap echoed from the trees. It was only a branch breaking under the weight of melting snow, but to Ash, it was an alarm. He reared, front hooves lashing out, eyes rolling white. For a terrifying moment, Raina thought he'd bolt straight into the trees. She held tight to the lead rope, heart pounding. "Ash! Ash, look at me! Come on, easy!" But he wasn't seeing her. Not really. He was somewhere else. Somewhere the air burned and commands came with pain. Raina dug deep, finding the voice her mother used to calm feral horses and broken hearts. "It's not real, boy. Not anymore. You're safe with me." After long minutes, Ash's breathing slowed, muscles trembling. He dropped his head, sweat tracing dark lines in his coat. Raina stroked his neck, her own hands shaking. "Someone trained you to fear, didn't they?" she whispered. "You weren't always free, were you?" She led him home, taking the long way along the river. The landscape was waking up, ice cracking in the current, birds trilling from bare branches, the world remembering how to hope. But for Raina, the fear in Ash's eyes lingered. It was more than the aftermath of a storm. This was trauma, old and deliberate. That afternoon, while brushing out his coat, Raina found something that had been hidden beneath the winter's thick hair. A broken leather harness strap, almost fused to his skin with mud and old sweat. It wasn't a regular halter, not like the ones she used. The leather was scarred, reinforced, and oddly heavy, clearly built for control. She unbuckled it, careful not to startle him, and held it up to the light. It was modified, she realized. Extra buckles, strange metal rings, and a makeshift tag that had been worn blank. She ran her thumb over the rough leather, anger flaring in her chest. Whoever had owned Ash before, they hadn't just used him. They'd controlled him, bent his will until it almost broke. As the days turned to weeks, more shadows surfaced. Ash was gentle with Raina and the mares, but certain things undid him. The sound of children's laughter from the road, the distant wail of a siren, a flash of a high-visibility vest when a neighbor walked past. Each time his body went rigid, nostrils flaring, haunted by memories she couldn't see. Sometimes late at night, Raina sat in the barn, listening to his restless pacing, his snorts and huffs as he circled his stall, as if waiting for someone to burst through the door and drag him back to a life of commands. One night, a spring storm rolled through, the kind with lightning that tore the sky and thunder that made the barn shake. Raina sat with Ash, singing the old lullaby that had calmed him during the blizzard. He pressed his head to her shoulder, body quaking with every crash of thunder. She stroked his mane, heart aching. "Shh, you're not broken, Ash," she murmured, as the rain hammered the tin roof. "You're brave. You survived." She found herself reflecting on her own scars, the pain that had driven Scott away, the ache of loneliness, the weight of never feeling quite enough. It struck her then. Ash wasn't just lost. He had been trained, used, maybe even tortured. Someone had tried to break him, but like her, he was still here. Damaged, yes, but stubbornly alive. The next morning, Raina decided to give Ash a gift. She took the old, broken harness and buried it beneath a pile of stones at the edge of the pasture. She wanted him to see it, a promise that his days of being controlled were over. When she returned, Ash stood waiting at the gate, head high, eyes clear and watchful. "Let's try again," she said, opening the gate. He stepped out, trembling but determined. They walked together, slow and cautious, two survivors making their way into the green-gold light of spring. And as they did, Raina felt something new, a quiet hope, like the first crocus pushing through snow. She knew now that Ash's story was more than chance. He wasn't just a stray. He was a living mystery, shaped by cruelty and courage, and she, for the first time in years, felt ready to help him write a new chapter. Whatever shadows lingered, they would face them together. The wild grip of winter had released Elk Hollow, and spring came flooding in. Days grew longer, green curled through brown earth, and birds returned with rowdy flurries of song. In the middle of all this renewal, Raina found herself increasingly obsessed, not just with Ash's rehabilitation, but with the mystery of where he came from, and who had left him broken in body and soul. Ash improved day by day, his wounds slowly knitting, his eyes softer and less haunted, but questions burned through Raina's mind. She often sat in her little studio, sketches of Ash piling up around her, every angle, every pose, every scar. She captured the wild fear in his posture, the intelligence in his gaze, but no drawing could explain the pain etched so deeply into him. The military brand on his neck nagged at her. So did the strange, reinforced harness. She needed answers. Raina cleared a space at her battered old desk, pushed aside unfinished commissions, and opened her laptop. The power was spotty, but her neighbor's generator sent enough juice through a makeshift line to let her get online. She began her search tentatively, not sure what she'd find. Government horses, military equine units. Some results looked like conspiracy theories, tales of experimental programs and secret training. She almost gave up, until she stumbled onto an archived news article from a decade ago. Headline faded, but legible. Delta Program, Equine Instinct and Surveillance. The story detailed a now-defunct government initiative, horses bred and trained for experimental reconnaissance, built for loyalty and discipline. There were grainy black and white photos of men in fatigues standing beside huge, dark horses. Raina's heart thudded. She scrolled, searching the faces and shapes. And then she saw him, a black stallion, unmistakable even in poor resolution, standing at the end of a line, a white blaze on his forehead, a wild glint in his eye. The caption read, "Subject Delta Black, Instinct Override Unsuccessful, Reassigned." The words rang in her ears. Instinct Override Unsuccessful, Reassigned. She leaned closer, desperate for more. The article ended abruptly, with a vague reference to budget cuts and unmanageable behavioral issues. But Raina wasn't finished. She dove into forums, old message boards, and even dark corners of the web. Most threads were dead or full of wild rumors, but a few old-timers remembered the Delta Project. One post chilled her. Delta escaped during the wildfire drill, refused command, last seen running north into the hills. There were whispers, stories that he'd broken free after refusing to obey an order, that he'd become legend among handlers for his intelligence and stubborn will. They called him defective, one user wrote. But he wasn't. He was just too smart to follow bad orders. Raina sat back, her heart pounding. Ash, her Ash, wasn't just a stray. He had chosen freedom, not wild by birth, but by defiance. He'd fled pain, commands, the weight of someone else's war. She felt a surge of awe and grief. What had he seen? What had been done to him to make him run so far, to carry so many scars? As night fell, Raina wrapped herself in a flannel shirt and brought her laptop into the barn. She set it on a bale of hay beside Ash's stall and read aloud, letting him hear the stories, the names, the hints of his past. He didn't react at first, chewing calmly, but when she reached the part about the wildfire drill, his body stilled. His eyes fixed on her, wide and knowing. "You remember, don't you?" she whispered, voice trembling. "You remember everything." The next day, unable to shake the questions, Raina called her friend Mara, a local historian with a knack for finding the unfindable. Mara listened, then promised to dig through public records and local newspapers. "If that horse was anywhere near here during the wildfires a few years back, there'll be something," Mara said. "Animals like him don't go unnoticed for long." Raina thanked her, feeling hope spark. While she waited, she spent her nights lost in research, her days with Ash. The work of caring for him kept her grounded, mixing mash, brushing his coat, exercising him gently along quiet trails. She learned his triggers and his comforts, how he would flinch at the clink of metal, but relax if she sang to him. He never let her touch his ears, but he'd lean against her shoulder and sigh, as if grateful for the company. Sometimes, she caught herself crying for no reason at all. She wondered how much pain Ash had carried, how much more he hid. She thought of the word defective, how men had branded him that way just because he wouldn't trample, wouldn't submit, wouldn't let himself be broken. The word echoed in her, mixing with all the times she'd been told to toughen up, to move on, to let go. One night, a new message arrived in her inbox. It was from Mara, with a scan of an old police report. Unidentified horse, black, large build, military-style brand, seen running loose during Elk Hollow wildfire evacuation. No owner claimed. Report closed. Raina stared at the words, tears in her eyes. It was Ash. It had to be. He had run through fire for freedom. Raina printed out every article, every image, every whisper. She tacked them to the barn wall, forming a rough timeline of Ash's journey, his beginnings, his captivity, his escape. She started to see patterns in the stories. Handlers who admired him, rumors of gentle moments, small acts of rebellion. People who'd worked with him remembered him as Shadow, a horse with a mind of his own. Late one night, as wind rattled the barn door, Raina sat beside Ash and read the words aloud again. He stood quietly, letting her rest a hand on his battered neck. She felt his heart beating, strong and steady beneath her palm. "You're not broken," she whispered. "You're free. You chose this." For the first time since Ash had staggered into her life, Raina felt the full weight of what he'd done. He'd been punished for refusing to obey, for trusting his own instincts over commands. She wondered how many people, how many animals, had been called broken for the same reason. She closed her eyes and leaned into the quiet, letting Ash's breath and the gentle shifting of the barn fill her up. In the silence, she realized she wasn't just helping Ash heal. She was finding her own way back to life, to art, to believing in things she couldn't explain. Some nights, when the wind blew and the stars burned over the Wyoming hills, Raina told Ash the story of the day he ran, how the fire raged, and how he had refused to go where they wanted, refused to hurt the innocent, chosen freedom over fear. She told him that in her eyes, and maybe someday in the world's, that made him a hero. And Ash, battered but unbroken, listened and watched, and for the first time seemed to rest easy. Spring in Elk Hollow could be beautiful, a patchwork of green hills and silver creeks, but on the morning the men arrived, the world was gray, soaked in a chill fog that clung to every branch and fence post. Raina woke with a sense of unease she couldn't shake. Ash had paced most of the night, restless, head tossing every time thunder rolled in the distance. She found herself drifting in and out of sleep on the cot she'd set up in the barn, always half listening for trouble. By sunrise, the sky was nothing but low cloud. Raina made coffee, fed the mares, and walked Ash along the edge of the pasture, letting him graze on tufts of early grass. The fog muffled sound, making everything feel close and far away at once. When the first rumble of a truck engine reached her ears, it sounded like it was coming from underwater. Raina squinted up the drive, mug in hand. A black pickup truck, newer than anything most locals drove, rolled slowly along the rutted lane. It stopped near the front fence. Two men stepped out, both wearing cold weather gear and dark sunglasses. Something about them, too stiff, too clean, set Raina's nerves on edge. She turned, trying to urge Ash back toward the barn. But he planted his hooves, neck arched, eyes wide. His entire body went rigid as the men approached the gate. "Morning," the taller one called, voice clipped. "We're looking for a missing horse." Raina kept her face neutral, but her pulse hammered in her throat. "Horses get loose all the time out here. You'll want to check with the sheriff." The shorter man smiled, but it was a tight, mirthless thing. "We're not here for just any horse, ma'am. We have reason to believe a black stallion, federal property, was seen in this area during the blizzard. Highly reactive animal. Dangerous, even." Raina glanced at Ash. He stood a few paces behind her, but she could feel his fear like static in the air. His tail flicked, his nostrils flared. Every muscle was ready to bolt. "He's not dangerous," she said too quickly. The men exchanged a look. "Ma'am, we'll need to see him. Official procedure." Raina blocked the gate, hands clenched on the wood. "Do you have paperwork? A court order?" The taller man bristled. "We're with a federal program. The horse is government property, classified. He's not yours to heal." That phrase, thrown out like a threat, sent a spike of cold through Raina's chest. She looked the man dead in the eyes. "That's funny. He's on my land, under my care, and he's hurt. Unless you have the law with you, you're not getting past this fence." Ash tossed his head, hooves stamping the damp earth. The fog seemed to thicken, swallowing the road behind the truck. The shorter man stepped closer, voice lowering. "You don't understand what you're dealing with. That horse, he's not what you think. He's been through things that make him dangerous to everyone. It's not your responsibility." Raina drew herself up, years of loneliness and loss turning to steel in her spine. "He's my responsibility now. You'll need to come back with the sheriff, or a judge." A long silence. The men stared at her, silent calculation in their eyes. The taller one reached into his coat and handed her a card. plain, white, with nothing but a number. Call us if he acts up, or if you change your mind. Accidents happen out here. The threat was unspoken, but heavy as lead. They turned, walked back to the truck, and drove off. Raina waited until the taillights vanished into the mist before letting her breath out. Her hands were shaking so badly she nearly dropped her mug. Ash was still rooted in place, trembling, sweat beading his flanks despite the cold. Raina hurried to his side, her voice low and soothing. "They're gone, Ash. They're not going to take you. Not while I'm here." She led him into the barn, bolted the doors, and pulled out her phone. No signal. She cursed under her breath and set about checking all the locks and windows, heart pounding. The men's words rattled in her skull. Highly reactive. May endanger civilians. He's not yours to heal. Raina didn't sleep that night. Every time the wind rattled the barn, she jerked awake, certain she'd see headlights coming up the lane. In the morning, she called Mara, voice barely steady. "They came," she said. "2 men. Government, I think. They want Ash back." Mara's answer was instant. "Don't let them bully you. If they were legit, they'd have brought a sheriff or a warrant. This sounds like intimidation. I'll call my cousin at the county office, see if there's any paperwork filed." Raina thanked her, relief and dread mixing in her veins. She knew she was out of her depth. This was no longer just about an abused horse. Ash was at the heart of something bigger, something dangerous. She took down the men's card and snapped a photo of the truck tracks in the mud, sending them to Mara for safekeeping. As the day wore on, news spread through the small town. A few neighbors dropped by, offering vague warnings about strangers asking questions. Raina tried to keep her routine normal, but every movement outside made her heart jump. She spent more time with Ash, working on building his trust, talking, singing, brushing out his coat until it gleamed. He seemed to sense her fear, pressing his head gently into her side, as if promising he wouldn't leave. But the encounter had changed something between them. Ash watched her more closely now, as if weighing whether she could really protect him. At night, he would circle his stall, gaze fixed on the barn door. Sometimes he whinnied low and broken, a sound that made Raina's chest ache. She kept her promise, though. She watched over Ash, fortified the barn, and waited for the next move. Each day she reminded herself, he's not dangerous. He's just been hurt. He deserves a chance. As the fog lifted and the hills brightened, Raina stood guard over the horse she'd rescued, her resolve hardening like spring soil after the thaw. Whatever secrets Ash carried, whatever shadows haunted him, she would stand between him and the world. No matter what men in the fog might threaten, she would not give him up, not now, not ever. Spring in Jackson Hole was a celebration. Art festivals blooming in every gallery, music pouring from open doors, tourists wandering with the awe of people who had never seen true wilderness. For the first time in a long while, Raina decided to risk stepping back into the world she'd retreated from, carrying more than just sketches and paints. She carried a story. Ash's presence had changed something fundamental in her. The fear that once kept her isolated had been replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. And though the men from the fog still haunted her dreams, their threats no longer ruled her days. Instead, she poured her anxiety and hope into her art, producing piece after piece of Ash, sometimes wild and storm-battered, sometimes calm, sometimes haunted by things unseen. The portrait she was most proud of she called "The One Who Ran." It was charcoal on heavy paper. Ash, mane flying, muscles tense, branded neck turned toward the light. Raina submitted it, anonymously, to a juried show in Jackson Hole. She expected nothing. The gallery's call for submissions was open to anyone, but she assumed her work would be lost among the landscapes and glossy wildlife portraits. She hung her entry, number 27, in a quiet corner and slipped away before the show opened. She didn't want to talk about the piece. She just wanted someone to see him. But word travels quickly in small towns. The afternoon after the opening, her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize, but she answered anyway, heart in her throat. "Is this the artist who drew the black stallion?" The woman's voice was husky, aged by grief and time. Raina hesitated. "Yes, Did you see the show?" A long pause. Then, "My name is Carolyn Myers. My husband worked at the Jackson Barracks years back. He handled horses for the Delta Project. That horse in your drawing, he's real, isn't he? You found him." The words slammed into Raina like a storm. She managed, "His name's Ash now. He's alive. He showed up during the blizzard." There was a ragged sigh on the other end. "They called him defective, but he was the bravest horse I ever saw. He refused to trample a protester during a wildfire drill. They punished him for it, burned over his brand, and shipped him off." Raina's hands trembled, clutching the phone. The weight of the secret felt lighter for the first time. "He ran all the way to me. He's safe, I promise." "Thank you," Carolyn whispered. "So many of them were lost. But we never forgot the ones who broke the rules for the right reasons. My husband called that stallion Shadow. He said he was the only horse who ever looked him in the eye and dared him to be better." Raina choked on tears. "If you want, I could send you a photo. He's healing. It's slow, but he trusts me." "I'd like that, dear. And you should know, people remember. People care." After she hung up, Raina sat in silence for a long time, the conversation replaying in her mind. She stared at the drawing, at the bold, defiant arch of Ash's neck, and realized it was no longer just a portrait. It was a testimony. A few days later, emails and messages began to trickle in, first from local veterans, then from people across the state. Some were brief. "Saw the sketch. Remember him? He was special." Others longer, full of stories about Ash or Shadow or Delta as they'd known him. Some described watching him stand his ground in the chaos of the wildfire drill, refusing commands no matter the threat or punishment. Others remembered seeing him in the holding pens, battered but unbroken. Veterans wrote of the bond they'd felt, of moments when Shadow had refused to act out cruelty, standing as a silent protest against orders. "They called him defective," one wrote, "but some of us called him a hero." The flood of memories stunned Raina. She spent long nights at her kitchen table, reading every message, printing out stories, adding them to the timeline on her barn wall. Ash, too, seemed to sense the change. He watched her with those deep, steady eyes, letting her touch the old brand more freely, as if knowing it was now a badge of survival. One afternoon, a group of townspeople came by the ranch, local veterans, a woman with a faded uniform jacket, a teenage girl with a sketched drawing of her own. They brought food for the horses, notes for Raina, and small tokens for Ash, a braided halter, a new brush, a poem written in shaky script. "He's not just your horse," the old woman said, smiling through tears. "He's ours too. He reminds us of what matters." Raina felt the pressure of years lift off her shoulders. For so long, she'd been trapped by her own pain, convinced no one could understand. Now her art had sparked a quiet rally. Neighbors and strangers drawn together by the simple, stubborn defiance of a horse who had chosen kindness over violence. One evening, as the sun set in streaks of purple and gold, Raina took Ash for a walk along the ridge behind her ranch. She talked to him about the people who'd written, about their memories and hopes, their shared longing for courage and redemption. Ash walked quietly beside her, occasionally nudging her arm with his nose, as if urging her onward. At the crest of the hill, Raina turned, looking back at the little town of Elk Hollow, at the far-off lights of Jackson Hole, and for the first time, she felt proud. Ash had become more than a rescue, more than a survivor. He was a symbol, a reminder that sometimes the bravest thing is to refuse the orders that break your spirit. As darkness settled, Raina whispered, "You're not broken, Ash. You're brave, and you're not alone anymore." When they returned to the barn, she found another email waiting. This one from a national journalist who'd seen the portrait online, now gone modestly viral. The subject line made her smile through her tears. The horse who refused. The world was beginning to hear Ash's story, and as the floodlights of evening played over the fields, Raina knew that the truth would not go back into the shadows. People remembered. People cared. And sometimes that was enough to change everything. The annual Teton County Fair was a cornerstone of the Wyoming spring, a week when the whole region shed its winter skin. Stalls brimmed with pies and quilts. The air was full of laughter and the scent of popcorn and dust, and banners snapped in the wild, bright wind. This year, word had spread that something different would grace the rescue horse showcase. An anonymous miracle stallion whose story had quietly united the town. Raina had never liked crowds. Her old life as an artist had been about observation, not performance. But since Ash, she'd learned that some stories needed to be seen, not just heard. So she agreed, though with a heart full of nerves, to walk Ash before the crowd. The local vet, 2 deputies, and half a dozen friends from Elk Hollow rallied around her for support. Mara had even sewn a deep blue rescue blanket, with Ash's name stitched in bold silver thread, the one who ran. Fair day dawned clear and sharp. Raina rose before dawn, checking Ash for the 3rd time. He'd grown sleek and strong in the month since the blizzard. His coat shining, his scars fading, but never forgotten. She braided his mane with quiet hands, humming the lullaby that calmed him on stormy nights. "We're not proving anything to anyone," she murmured. "We're just showing them you're here. That's enough." They trailered Ash in early, arriving before the crowds swelled. The rescue showcase was set at the edge of the arena, just beyond the Midway Games and the old Ferris wheel. Other horses lined the fence, rescued mustangs, abandoned mares, a blind gelding named Toby who bobbed his head in greeting. The handlers were mostly local ranchers and teens from the 4-H club, nervous but determined. As the first bleachers filled, Raina paced with Ash behind the chutes, feeling the pulse of the crowd. Curiosity, expectation, the restless energy of 100 strangers. She focused on Ash's breathing, matching his rhythm, grounding herself in the steady thump of his heart beneath her hand. Soon it was their turn. A volunteer called her name, voice amplified through the loudspeaker. The announcer started to speak. "Next up, we have Ash, a rescue with a story you won't believe." But something went wrong. The sound system glitched, producing a shrill, metallic screech that echoed through the arena. For Ash, it was too much. The sharp electronic wail ripped through his calm like a knife. He reared, eyes wild, tearing free from Raina's grip. The world seemed to freeze. Ash bolted across the arena, hooves pounding, mane flying. Spectators gasped, scrambling back from the rails. Raina's heart thudded in her chest, but she fought panic, calling to Ash with every ounce of calm she could muster. "Ash! Hey, Ash, look at me! It's okay!" He spun at the far end of the ring, nostrils flaring, searching for an exit. Just then, a toddler wandered from his mother's side, clutching a sticky, half-eaten apple, stumbling directly into Ash's path. Time slowed. Every muscle in Ash's body coiled, instinct screaming at him to flee or defend himself. The crowd screamed. Raina ran, legs burning, voice cracking. "Ash, I'm here!" The stallion thundered toward the child, then impossibly stopped just inches away, snorting, head low. His sides heaved, but he did not run. He did not bolt or lash out. He just stood there, shivering with the effort to hold himself still. A hush fell over the arena, the kind that follows the sharp intake of a collective breath. Raina rushed forward, kneeling beside the child, her hands trembling. The little boy looked up, wide-eyed, then reached out and gently wrapped his arms around Ash's leg. "He's not scary," the boy announced to no one in particular. "He's sad." The child's mother hurried over, scooping him up, eyes wet with relief and awe. Raina stroked Ash's nose, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You did good," she whispered, her voice choked. "You did so good." Someone in the crowd caught the whole thing on their phone. Within hours, the video was everywhere, shared by local news, then picked up by national outlets, then spun out into the wild universe of the internet. Miracle rescue horse saves child at county fair. Stallion shows heart in tense standoff. Headlines swirled, and Ash's story caught fire. The media attention brought a rush of visitors to Elk Hollow. Journalists, activists, and horse lovers arrived at Raina's ranch with questions and cameras. Some came for the spectacle, but many came with quiet gratitude. A veteran with his service dog, a woman who'd once worked at the barracks, children clutching drawings of Ash. People left notes in the mailbox, prayers at the pasture fence. A group of local students painted a mural on the town hall, Ash rearing above the wild Wyoming grass. At first, Raina was overwhelmed. She feared the attention would frighten Ash, undoing all his progress. But he surprised her again. The more people shared his story, the calmer he seemed, as if recognizing the faces and voices that now arrived with open hands and kind words. He let children stroke his neck, let elders rest their hands on his mane, let those with stories of pain or hope whisper secrets only he could hold. One day, a reporter asked Raina on camera, "What do you think makes Ash so special?" She looked at Ash, who stood behind her with that steady, unbreakable gaze. "He's not special because he's perfect," she answered, voice clear. "He's special because he survived, and because when he was asked to do something wrong, he refused. He taught us that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is just stop and stand your ground." That night, Raina scrolled through the endless flood of comments and messages, some angry, some amazed, most simply grateful. Survivors wrote to her, people who had run from violence or war, people who'd been punished for saying no. "Your horse reminds me of myself," one woman wrote. "I thought I was broken for refusing. Now I see maybe I was strong." Ash became a symbol, a patchwork of memory and myth, a vessel for hope and quiet resistance. Raina understood that this was bigger than either of them now. His story didn't belong to her alone. It belonged to every person who had ever stood up or knelt down and chosen kindness over fear. As the fair ended and the crowds drifted away, Raina stood with Ash in the empty arena, moonlight painting their shadows across the dirt. She pressed her forehead to his, feeling the quiet thud of his heart and her own. Two survivors holding each other steady in a world that could be cruel, but also, sometimes, impossibly gentle. It was late summer when the invitation arrived. Raina opened her battered mailbox one golden morning to find a pale blue envelope embossed with the seal of the Wyoming Trauma Recovery Conference. She stared at it for a long moment, feeling a swirl of anxiety and pride. Her hands shook as she read the note. "We would be honored if you would share your story of ash, of healing, of survival. Our attendees are survivors, therapists, and advocates from across the region. We believe your perspective is needed." Raina carried the letter back to the house, heart thudding. For years she'd hidden her wounds, her heartbreak, her losses, her fear of never being whole again. Now, she was being asked to step into the light and speak not just for herself, but for a horse who had survived a world of pain. She thought about saying no. Crowds still unsettled her, and public speaking was a terror she'd avoided since college. But every time she looked at Ash, grazing in the bright green pasture, she knew she had no real choice. Some stories weren't just for the teller. They were for everyone still struggling to find their voice. So on a warm September morning, Raina loaded Ash's old harness into a canvas bag and drove to the conference center in Laramie. The drive was long and beautiful, golden fields rolling out beneath an endless blue sky. With every mile, she practiced her words, letting them shape themselves into something honest. The conference was buzzing with energy. Hundreds of people filled the halls, some in wheelchairs, some walking with service dogs, others just carrying the visible and invisible marks of battles fought and survived. Raina was introduced as a local artist and the rescuer of a remarkable horse whose story touched the nation. She felt her stomach clench with nerves as she took the stage, clutching her bag. She began simply, her voice trembling at first, but growing steadier as she spoke. Most people in Elk Hollow knew me as the artist who vanished after a heartbreak. I didn't want to be seen. I stopped making art. I stopped visiting friends. I stopped believing in second chances. Until one night, in the middle of a snowstorm, a battered stallion changed everything. Raina paused, letting the story take shape. The blizzard, the whinny in the dark, the rescue, the wounds. She told them how Ash wasn't just lost, but branded and broken by a system that valued obedience above all. He was meant to carry someone else's war, someone else's fear, she said, her voice tightening. He was branded for disobedience, called defective, punished because he refused to hurt an innocent. They tried to burn his instincts away, but he wouldn't let them. She reached into her bag and drew out the old harness, now encased in a glass display box. Sunlight caught the worn leather and the makeshift metal tags. She held it up so everyone could see. This is what was used to control him. Heavy leather, reinforced with metal, designed to break his will. I keep it now, not as a memory of pain, but as a reminder of what he overcame, of what so many of us overcome, every day. A hush settled over the room. Raina's eyes swept the crowd, finding dozens of faces streaked with tears or shining with encouragement. I used to think healing meant fixing every broken thing inside me, she continued softly. But Ash taught me that healing is about making space for what's wounded, not erasing it. It's about honoring the part of us that survived, even when others called it defective. She recounted the first night Ash trusted her, the moment when, after weeks of patient tending and late-night lullabies, he pressed his forehead to her chest. That moment wasn't flashy, no fireworks, no triumph, just two broken things leaning on each other for warmth. That's what recovery looks like some days. Quiet, ordinary moments where you remember you're not alone. Raina spoke of the days that followed, how the town rallied around Ash, how strangers wrote to share their stories of survival, resistance, and quiet rebellion. She read a few lines from the letters she'd received. He reminds me I'm not weak for saying no. His story helped me forgive myself. Thank you for showing that defiance can be an act of love. She paused again, the conference room holding its breath. Then she said, Ash's journey challenges a belief that runs deep in our world, that defiance is dangerous, that if you don't obey, you deserve what happens to you. But Ash refused to hurt. He refused to be used. He risked everything for a chance to be free, to do right, to live by his own conscience. Isn't that what we want to teach our children? That the ones who break rank to protect the innocent are our true guides? Raina closed her speech with a reflection, voice trembling with gratitude and hope. I rescued Ash, but really he rescued me. He showed me that scars don't have to be shameful. They can be proof you chose something better, that you survived. Thunderous applause filled the hall. People rose to their feet, clapping and wiping their eyes. After the talk, dozens came to thank her. Trauma survivors, therapists, parents, and even a few veterans who remembered the Delta Project. Some brought their own keepsakes of pain, old dog tags, broken jewelry, faded photographs. Others just asked for a hug, or to see the harness up close. One teenage girl with pink streaks in her hair pressed a note into Raina's hand. Thank you for telling the truth. I'm learning to stand up for myself too. Ash is my hero. Later that afternoon, Raina stepped outside into the September sun, feeling lighter than she had in years. The world was still imperfect, still dangerous, but it also contained kindness and courage, stitched together by stories and by the people willing to share them. Driving home, Raina let herself remember every hard thing she and Ash had overcome. The cold, the fear, the threats from men who saw only property, not a soul worth saving. She let herself hope that maybe, just maybe, their story would keep traveling, finding others who needed it. Maybe it would help someone else find the strength to resist what was wrong, to stand up for what was right, to believe that their scars, too, were proof of survival. As dusk painted the world in soft gold, Raina thought of Ash in his pasture, head high, eyes bright, as if daring the future to do its worst. She smiled, the last of her fear melting away. They were no longer alone. And that was enough. 1 year later, the world around Elk Hollow had changed, and so had Raina Hughes. What had started with a whinny in the storm and a battered black stallion tangled in wire had grown into something she never could have imagined. A story that echoed through a community, a movement of healing and quiet resistance. Spring returned in a rush of green and gold, wildflowers painting the hills behind Raina's ranch. Where last year had been survival, this year was renewal. Raina had rebuilt the old pasture, extending the fencing into a gentle, rolling grove of birch trees, a sanctuary she called Ash's Grove. At the heart of it stood a simple stone marker, carved with careful hands. Ash, who chose to stay. Ash grazed among the other rescued horses. Head high, his once scarred coat now a glossy midnight ribbon beneath the sun. He still bore the brand on his neck and a constellation of old wounds. But there was pride in his carriage. He was not just surviving. He was leading. Other Mustangs, broken, anxious, cast away by a world too quick to judge, had come to join him. Some bore rope scars, some limped, some were so wary they'd barely let themselves be touched. But Ash, with a patience only the wounded possess, welcomed them with a gentle nudge or the simple presence of his strength. Raina had changed too. She walked the hills every morning, boots soaking in dew, her sketchbook always close. Her art flourished as she taught herself to see the world not just for its sharpness and pain, but for its small, resilient beauties. A young foal running in the grass, a child's laughter echoing from the grove, the quiet gratitude in a horse's dark eyes. More than that, she opened her doors to others, children from the local school, troubled teens, survivors from the trauma center, families who needed a place to breathe and feel whole again. The equine therapy program grew quietly at first, then quickly. Raina watched as wary children approached Ash with trembling hands, their worries written in the tense lines of their bodies. Some of them came from chaos, foster care, broken homes, battles with anxiety and fear that seemed larger than themselves. Ash never asked for anything but presence. He would lower his great head and let them touch the white blaze on his brow, his breath slow and deep, steadying their nerves. The bravest among them would press their foreheads to his and close their eyes, sharing a moment of silent understanding. One afternoon, a teen runaway named Lila showed up at the ranch gate, clothes threadbare, eyes fierce and wary. She'd heard about Ash from a friend at the shelter. For days, she refused to speak, eating in silence, slipping out to the pasture at dawn. One evening, Raina found her standing in Ash's grove, tears streaking her dirty cheeks, her hands pressed against Ash's side. When Raina approached, Lila whispered, "He doesn't expect anything from me. He just lets me be." In that simple act of acceptance, Lila found the beginning of healing, and so did Raina. Raina's story and Ash's made its way to places she never dreamed. The local museum created a new exhibit, Animals of Resistance. Raina donated Ash's old, broken harness, now clean, displayed under glass, the heavy leather a symbol of endurance, not captivity. The exhibit featured letters, sketches, and video messages from people across the country. Soldiers who remembered Delta Black, children who saw themselves in Ash's courage, therapists who used the story to teach about survival and boundaries. People came from far away, sometimes to visit, sometimes just to see the grove and leave a note, a ribbon, or a pebble at Ash's marker. They left stories of their own struggles, tiny acts of rebellion, memories of the moment they refused to be broken. Raina collected these messages, adding them to a living archive in the barn. Every so often, she would read a handful to Ash, her voice low and steady as the Wyoming wind. One bright June morning, Raina stood with a group of children in the shade of the birch trees. The light dappled their faces. The air smelled of wild mint and horse. Ash grazed nearby, flicking his ears to catch their laughter. Raina held up her sketchbook, flipping through page after page of Ash's journey. His first wary look at the camera, the tangled wire, the slow transformation from fear to trust. She spoke gently. When Ash came to me, he was hurt. He had every reason to be angry at the world, but he never gave up. He taught me that you don't need permission to be good. You don't have to let your past decide your future. You can choose every day to trust, to help, to try again. One little boy raised his hand. Why didn't Ash run away again? If he was free, why did he stay? Raina smiled, blinking back tears. He stayed because he found something better than running. He found a place where he was understood. He found friends, and he found himself. Sometimes, that's all any of us need. The kids scattered into the pasture, their laughter pealing like bells. Raina watched Lila gently brushing Ash, saw the ease in Ash's eyes, the sense of peace in the air. It was more than she'd ever hoped for. That afternoon, as sun dipped low and painted the world in gold, Raina took Ash's harness, the last relic of his captivity, and carried it to the museum in town. She placed it in the glass case herself, a final act of letting go. The plaque beneath read, "For Ash, and for all who refuse to be tamed not out of rebellion, but because they are meant to lead." As she left the museum, Raina felt the weight she'd carried for so long finally lift. Her pain had become a story, her story had become hope, and that hope had taken root in the lives of others. That evening, as dusk painted the hills and the first stars pricked the velvet sky, Raina sat beside Ash beneath the birches. She leaned against his warm, strong shoulder and watched the other horses drift through the grove, their shadows long and soft. For a moment, all the noise of the world faded. There was only the hush of wind, the breath of the earth, and the deep, quiet wisdom of a horse who had chosen to stay. Raina closed her eyes, whispering the words she wanted everyone to remember. Ash didn't need permission to be good. He chose it, and so can you. Underscore, 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 underscore. If this story moved you, support a rescue, share it, and remember, some spirits refuse to be tamed not out of rebellion, but because they were meant to lead.